Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. I started writing things down again. Not because it helps. Not because I expect anyone to read this. I need something to return to tomorrow that proves I existed today. Yesterday, I found 3 identical notes in my handwriting, none of which I remember writing. Each dated differently. Each placed in a different folder I never created. I sorted them, labeled them, tucked them in my field binder. I don't know why. Maybe because it's easier to file madness than face it. The dig was supposed to be routine. Survey, clear, log, preserve. That's what we're trained for. Control the process, measure every layer. Time is linear when you document it. Time behaves when you're holding a clipboard. It started small. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. A label on a sample bag I hadn't written. A recorder that wouldn't play back a conversation I was certain we'd had. I double-checked everything. I blamed sleep. I blamed stress. I blamed the generator. Nothing convinces you faster that you're fine than knowing exactly who to blame. I started checking my own handwriting against older logs. I stopped recognizing the slant of the R's. The spacing of the dates. I found a tag on one of the soil cores with my signature in a style I haven't used since undergrad. I stared at it for 10 minutes, trying to decide whether that made it mine or not. The others didn't notice. Or maybe they did. Maybe they noticed different things. One of them kept asking where his camera battery went, even though he hadn't brought one. Another spent a full afternoon redrawing the same elevation sketch, over and over, like the hill wouldn't stay still on the page. Something's wrong. Not broken. Wrong. Things still work. The sun still sets. Equipment still logs. I still speak. But there's a slant to everything now. As if we're walking across a floor that looks level, but the water always runs one direction. As if the place beneath our feet isn't aligned with what it used to be. There's a sound at night. Not mechanical. Not animal. It repeats, but never the same way twice. I stopped asking if anyone else hears it. They've started looking at me like I've asked before. I don't remember asking. I organize the folders every morning. The names change. Not drastically. Just enough. Layer 3 west wall becomes ledge 3 west face. Amini notes becomes primary log L. The content stays the same. Just the labels drift. Like everything's slowly being renamed from some other version of itself. I don't think I'm losing my mind. I think my mind is staying still while everything else changes around it. There's a photo in the archive I don't remember taking. It shows me, holding a clipboard, smiling at something just outside frame. There's no shadow. No reflection. Just the edge of my face, lit by something I can't see. I looked at that photo for 20 minutes today. I felt like I was looking through glass into something that remembers me, even though I've never seen it before. I'm not scared. That's not the word. This isn't fear. It's something slower, heavier. Like trying to walk through water and realizing it's not water at all, but something with memory. I've locked the original folders. Backed up the backups. I don't know what good it'll do. Things don't vanish here. They just adjust. If I ever start writing in a language I don't know, I hope I have the sense to stop. If I don't, maybe that'll be the proof I need. That something else took over. That whatever's leaking through doesn't need to scream or shake the ground. It only needs to be noticed. Tur Abdin, southeastern Turkey. April. Dry heat. Quiet wind. The kind of silence that doesn't ask questions. We set up base just north of the slope where the ruins first emerged. Erosion had chewed the surface clean of soil over the years, revealing limestone steps no record had mapped. Nothing matched. No satellite imagery showed this structure. No survey logs. Just stone. Cut with precision, buried under nothing. There were 7 of us. A lean team, mostly academic. 2 field techs, 1 structural engineer, a regional liaison, our documentarian, and me. We'd worked together before. We knew what to expect. Excavation is methodical. Boring, even. That's the point. Measure, grid, photograph, repeat. The more careful the process, the less room there is for myth. The western face collapsed easily under structured clearance. The stone was worn but stable. Just behind the facade, we found what we assumed was a storage vault, sealed tight with mineral fusion. Not a brick wall, not loose rubble, fused. Like glass under heat, but no signs of burning. It shouldn't have been there. Structures that age don't seal themselves. They collapse. They don't lock shut and stay that way for centuries. We took core samples, tested gas presence, ran spectrometry. No toxins. No radiation. No heat signature. After 2 days of calculations, we opened the chamber by mechanical pressure release. It hissed once. No rush of air. Just that one sound and nothing else. Inside, no dust. No mold. Dry. Preserve. The kind of preservation that doesn't come from design, but from time forgetting to touch a place. The walls were bare. No carvings, no pigment, no offerings. Just smooth surfaces and one object. It sat at the center of the chamber on a small raised pedestal, no higher than a kneeling stone. The object itself wasn't large. Slightly bigger than a closed fist. Metallic. Not reflective. Its shape, there's no simple description. Not a cube. Not a sphere. Not quite symmetrical, but with just enough order to make your eyes think it should be. You'd look at one side, swear it had a pattern, rotate slightly, and that pattern would undo itself. We passed it hand to hand for an hour before anyone said anything. It was cold. Not just surface cold, something deeper. Not a temperature, exactly, but a sensation. Like it didn't belong to the air around it. It had no seams, no joints, no points of interaction. But it wasn't ornamental. There was a purpose behind it. You could feel it. Not from detail, but from the absence of randomness. Every contour dared you to name it. Every angle refused. We named it Zeta 4. A formality. Labels make things manageable. We logged it in the catalog, photographed it from all sides, bagged it in thermal-neutral containment, and marked the site for further excavation. Everything about the chamber said it should hold more. But it didn't. That was the first discomfort. The space seemed built to contain only one thing. Nothing else. Not even dust dared to enter. The field logs were clean. No anomalies. No instrument errors. Nothing to suggest what would follow. Just one entry, recorded on my second review pass, buried at the bottom of the daily summary. Object exhibits presence. That's all I wrote. No follow-up. No context. Just that line. I don't remember writing it. I wouldn't have used that word. Not in a professional document. Presence. We continued work as planned. Layers above the chamber were sectioned off for stratigraphy. Soil was moved, catalogued, rebagged. The equipment functioned normally. Everyone carried on with protocol. But the feeling didn't fade. That cold shape at the center of the chamber stayed with us, no matter where we stood. You'd feel it in your back, even when your eyes weren't on it. I reviewed the footage that night. Cameras mounted at every angle. Static shots. Time stamps aligned. Every frame showed the same object in the same position. Except one, at 3:07. 42 frames where the object appeared to be misaligned. Shifted. Not moved, displaced. Not visibly. Just wrong. You had to watch it 10 times to see it. And once you did, you couldn't unsee it. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I wanted to keep it quiet. I didn't know what to say. This thing we found might not be where we left it. That's not something you open a staff meeting with. You let it settle. You wait. You watch. That was the beginning. Nothing dramatic. No thunder. No crack in the earth. Just a sealed room that shouldn't have existed, holding a shape that resisted names, and a sense, deep in your teeth, that something had just been remembered by the wrong people. We started testing the object within 12 hours of extraction. We ran the standard checks first: mass, density, electromagnetic readings. The weight didn't match its volume. It was too heavy for what it was. No external power source. No magnetism. It didn't conduct. It didn't emit. It didn't absorb. It just remained. Surface analysis returned nothing recognizable. Not a composite. Not an alloy. No decay signature. No oxidation. No particulate residue under scraping. Even when exposed to thermal extremes, it showed no measurable response. We heated it, cooled it, scanned it. Nothing registered. The instruments didn't behave incorrectly, they simply recorded the absence of behavior. One of the field scopes caught an anomaly during an internal resonance scan. I watched it 3 times before I called for a second opinion. Inside, the object showed structure. Layers, repeating shapes nested at tight intervals. The pattern went too deep for the scanner to read. Past the limit of the signal return, there was still formation, clean, ordered. And yet no evidence of moving parts. No cavities. No interfaces. No internal energy source. The object shouldn't have had a structure like that without function. It didn't open. It didn't react. But it wasn't inert. There was something in the way it sat, in the way it maintained position, as if even gravity only touched it politely. I recorded my initial assessment aloud, thinking out loud into my memo log. When I played it back later that night, the middle portion was gone. Not corrupted. Not erased. It had been overwritten with my voice, repeating a phrase I don't remember speaking. Not an error. Not background noise. My voice, reciting something that had no connection to the analysis. A string of words that meant nothing, until I found them handwritten on the edge of my field notes the next morning. The ink was fresh. I hadn't picked up a pen since the day before. Our spectrum analyzer began misbehaving next. It read stable, then froze, only to reset with a new date stamped on the interface. A date that hadn't occurred yet. I checked the hardware log. The device believed it had undergone recalibration during the period it had been switched off. The lab computer registered an access session no one remembered. We had built the field tent to isolate equipment from ambient noise. No cellular interference. No GPS bleed. Despite that, the triangulation system began reporting minor drift from the fixed beacons. 2 centimeters off. Then 4. Then 6. I thought it was ground instability. I had the soil techs run compression profiles. The ground was still. It was the readings that shifted, not the station. The equipment believed it had moved, though nothing had. I kept my own notes separate. I started writing timestamps in the margins. I wanted to know if things were being rewritten. If memory was failing. If I was failing. One of the entries from day 3 no longer matched what I remembered writing. The content was correct. The tone wasn't. The words were mine, but the rhythm was foreign. Too clean. Too precise. I wrote it, but it didn't sound like me. I shared none of this with the others. At that point, I couldn't trust what would stay consistent from hour to hour. I began checking the object's position by hand each morning. It never moved, but every day it seemed to sit just slightly wrong on the mat. Same location, but misaligned. Just enough to suggest it was aware of being measured. At night, the recordings on my handheld recorder began starting early. 3 seconds of silence before my voice, where I hadn't pressed record. No click. No distortion. Just silence. And once, faint breathing. That was the night I woke with dirt under my fingernails and a half-finished note in my hand. Do not touch the grooves when they align. No grooves were visible. I never touched the surface without gloves. I never wrote that sentence. We kept testing. Not because we thought we'd find something new, but because we couldn't explain what we hadn't found. An object that resisted time, refused temperature, ignored magnetism, and began adjusting the recordings made in its proximity. It didn't malfunction our tools. It used them, redirected them, subtly, methodically, not to erase, not to damage, but to interfere just enough that the questions would always be slightly out of reach. There's no unit for that. No form to log that sensation. No entry code for something that mimics your memory before you've even formed it. So we kept working. As if by understanding it, we could push back whatever had already started pulling at the edges of what we knew to be real. The first time my watch reset, I didn't think much of it. Digital displays fail. Batteries hiccup. A few seconds lost to static, maybe. But this wasn't seconds. It was a full reset. All zeros. No date. Just blinking. As if time, for a moment, had nowhere to begin. I set it manually, logged the error, moved on. But it happened again. The next night. Same hour. Same minute. Zeroed out without warning. No alarm, no backlight. Just a blank silence where time should have been. I checked the others. Their watches held steady. The satellite clock hadn't shifted. Only mine. It would have passed as a fault. I even told myself to ignore it. But there was something else. At 3:17 each night, without fail, the generator pitched. Not a full outage. No shutdown. Just a low pulse. A slight dimming of light, a soft drop in the hum. Measured. Predictable. Exact to the second. It wasn't mechanical fatigue. It wasn't thermal. We checked the lines, the grounding, the load. Nothing was wrong. Every night at that moment the generator lost rhythm. Not enough to stop anything. Just enough to be noticed. As if it were listening to something we couldn't hear, and hesitating. We laughed about it once. Just to break the tension. Called it the heartbeat of the site. A joke. A nervous habit pretending to be humor. But the object never moved. Never spoke. Never changed. It sat inside the lab tent without temperature, without sound. Watching without eyes. One afternoon during cataloging, I overheard someone say it felt like the object wanted to remember something. The words stopped me cold. Not because of what they meant, but because of how easily they were said. Not as speculation. Not as fear. As observation. Like someone had picked up a kettle and found it warm without a flame. No drama. Just the wrongness of quiet purpose. I don't know why those words stayed with me. Maybe because they echoed something I hadn't admitted yet. That the object didn't feel lost. It felt paused. As if we hadn't discovered it. We had resumed it. The lab notes were piling up by then. Observations, readings, measurement. I kept mine separate. I wanted clarity. A clean record untouched by cross-contamination. I wrote each day's summary in longhand, in ink, dated and marked with weather, soil condition, equipment function. One morning, I found a summary already waiting on my desk. Neatly stacked. Exactly where I would have placed it. My handwriting. My style. Dated correctly. The content matched what I remembered. But I hadn't written it. I searched for the duplicate in my notebook. No second copy. Nothing in my bag. I couldn't recall when I would have written it, but it was too specific to fake. It mentioned a soil density change we hadn't discovered until late in the afternoon. It referenced a conversation about the device's surface resonance. A conversation that hadn't happened until after dinner. The note was real. The ink was fresh. I tried to recall the moment of writing and found nothing. Just the static of absence. As if that part of the day had been lived without me in it. I kept the page. I didn't tell anyone. It felt like admitting it would make it worse. That saying it aloud would allow it to settle deeper. I stayed quiet. And the object remained still. Untouched. Heavy. Centered. With nothing in its presence except the quiet suggestion that we had arrived late to something already in motion. We started cross-referencing the samples by habit. Carbon readings taken across 4 different strata. Clean material. Charcoal flecks. Organic residue from soil compression near the chamber entrance. Standard dating procedure, nothing complicated. But the returns didn't agree. Not just by margin, not by contamination. Thousands of years apart. Same sample, different position on the table, completely different result. One came back as 7th century BCE. The next 29,000 years. Another showed pre-anthropic carbon levels altogether. We reran the controls. New instruments. New filters. It kept happening. We thought maybe the object was leaching radiation, interfering with decay chains. But the dosimeters were flat. No spikes. No trace radiation of any kind. The object didn't emit. It didn't absorb. It simply changed the outcome of measurement. Quietly. Reproducibly. Without leaving evidence. Someone suggested isolating the lab equipment offsite. Good idea. Until we realized the anomalies were already showing up in the digital logs. Not the scans. The storage metadata. Files tagged with timestamps we hadn't reached yet. Files duplicated but not matching. Files with sizes that varied depending on what screen you open them on. No one wanted to say what we were thinking. That the results weren't corrupted. They were precise. Just impossibly so. I tried to shift focus. Find something stable. So I went through the dig photos. Catalog shots taken over the previous 48 hours. Standard documentation. Faces. Labels. Stone alignments. Minor shifts from angle and light. Normal. Until I noticed the background of one set. The team standing at the West Trench. Smiling. Dust covered. One person short. I checked the file name. It matched the sequence. Time stamped 4 minutes after the previous frame. The earlier photo showed all 7 of us. The next showed 6. No shadows. No blur. Just absence. A space where someone should have been. No one moved. No one stepped out. The formation was identical. The positions unchanged. Just a gap, as if a presence had been removed without disturbing the air around it. I showed the others. No one saw the problem. They remembered only 6. I didn't press. I told myself I was misremembering the number. I was tired. I was overthinking. Until I looked at my own note. Field entries with initials. 7 names. 7 lines. The 7th scratched out without explanation. Later that day, I heard a humming sound behind me. Soft. Repeating. A tune. Wordless but deliberate. I turned to look, but no one acknowledged it. I asked if anyone heard it. No one had. I let it pass. Recorded it mentally as stress. But something didn't sit right. That evening, while syncing the audio archives, I found a file that shouldn't have existed. It wasn't in the active folder. It wasn't on the creation list. Just a loose file labeled reason_song.wave. The date attached was 3 days ahead. Not modified. Created. The playback was distorted. A faint rhythm. No lyrics. No ambient noise. Just that same humming I'd heard before. Isolated. Clean. I ran a frequency trace. It showed no interference. No mixing. No compression. A pure source. It hadn't been captured through a microphone. It had been generated directly into the archive. I checked the access log. It listed me as the origin. The time on my watch had reset again that morning. To 0. Without alarm, without indication. Just blank space where continuity should have been. I marked the time, filed the note, and set the watch forward manually. Hours later, I found a photo of myself checking the watch, time displayed, exactly matching the false reset. That moment had been recorded. But the time shown was not what I remembered seeing. I slept 3 hours that night. Maybe less. When I woke, I had a page of notes I couldn't place. My handwriting. Fresh ink. A detailed transcript of a soil analysis that hadn't been performed yet. No instrument had touched the sample. The entry ended mid-sentence. A recommendation for a test I hadn't considered. I checked the voice memos. The first file opened without prompt. My voice again. Calm. Structured. Reading the same sentence that ended the note. Word for word. Same pause. Same breath. I don't remember recording it. I don't remember speaking the words. But the voice was mine. Not just the tone. The cadence. The subtle tremor when something real leaks into the margins of routine. That was the last moment I allowed myself to call it coincidence. After that, everything became accounting. A quiet attempt to track whatever this was through the narrowing corridor of what we still thought of as time. His cot was made. The blanket folded. Boots underneath, toes out. Clipboard on the stool beside it, capped pen resting over the edge. Nothing disturbed. Nothing moved. Not the kind of absence you notice immediately. There were drills running, radio chatter, a delivery at base. People were busy. It wasn't until the evening checklist that I realized he hadn't signed in. No lab hours. No report entry. His voice hadn't been heard on comms all day. I asked where he'd gone. One of the others looked at me like I'd mispronounced a word. Just a pause. A flat stare. I repeated the question. The answer didn't come as confusion. It came as certainty. Calm. Thoughtless. There's no one named Rizan on the team. That wasn't a mistake. That was dismissal. I waited. Nothing changed in their expression. No twitch of recollection. No doubt. No effort to remember, because they truly believed there was nothing to remember. I tried again. No response. Just the sound of notes being flipped. Someone asked about soil sample tags. Conversation resumed. I left the tent and walked the perimeter. His workstation was untouched. The notes I had given him were still clipped to the board. The coffee stain he'd made 2 days before was dry in the exact shape I remembered. His jacket was still hanging over the second chair at the console. Half-zipped. The cord from his field recorder coiled around the base of the power outlet. I bent to unplug it and realized it had already been disconnected. Logged off. Like it had never been used. I opened the archive from the previous week. Group documentation. Camp logs. I knew he was there. I had the visual memory. His laugh during the storm. The joke about thermal gloves. I remembered the way he stood with his shoulders slightly forward, never fully facing the object. I opened the first group photo. 6 faces. Sharp. Clear. Next photo. 7 figures. But the one furthest left was blurred. Not motion blur. Not lighting. A soft smear where definition should be. The height was right. The posture. But the face wouldn't resolve. The image was perfect, except that one figure. Every time I looked at it, my brain tried to correct it. Tried to fill in the gap. I couldn't hold the image still. I searched for his name in the staff manifest. Nothing. No entry. No badge assignment. I checked the storage logs. No sign-in records for his lab sessions. No download history. I still had the voice file, his humming. I opened it. It wouldn't play. The file existed. The data was present. But no output. Just 0 duration. It had been reduced to name only. I wrote his name in my field journal, once at the top of the page, once in the margin. I tore the page out and placed it in the bottom of my case. I didn't want to test if it would vanish. I just wanted something physical. Something with ink and pressure and intention. I checked again after dinner. The page was still there. The ink still legible. But the letters were faint. As if handled too much. As if time had pressed against them. This is when I knew something was wrong. Not when he vanished. When I realized I was the only one who remembered he had ever been there. A field report was waiting on my desk before breakfast. Dated with that morning's time stamp. Labeled with my signature. Cross-referenced to a stratigraphic scan that hadn't yet been completed. I turned to check the main tent. The equipment was still covered. No one had entered the site yet. I hadn't written the report, but it carried my observations. Layer compression, quartz dispersion, mineral densities. Precise. Accurate. Only one paragraph off. A brief mention of an anomaly at the north edge of Trench 4. That part hadn't happened yet. 3 hours later, during the first round of sampling, one of the assistants flagged a spike in density that matched the report. Same depth. Same coordinates. He hadn't seen my notes. The data hadn't been shared. I hadn't shared it because I didn't trust it. The moment I saw the core reading confirm what had already been typed, I knew the document hadn't predicted the event. It had reported it. In advance. I checked the archive logs again. Nothing altered. File creation time held. No edits. No duplication. No changes in authorship. It was as if the action had followed the note. As if the note was the anchor and the event the echo. Later that afternoon, we isolated a fragment from the main object casing. A sliver no larger than a coin, taken under microabrasion. During resonance calibration, the sample began to vibrate. No heat, no structural distortion. Just motion. We watched in silence. The sound wasn't audible, but the sensors logged frequency. Low. Steady. Embedded in the waveform was something else. Not tonal. Not random. Speech pattern. I ran a spectrum analysis. The waveform displayed interval spacing consistent with linguistic pacing. Pauses. Stress peak. Syntax rhythm. There were no words, not in any language we recognized. But the cadence was undeniable. It was talking. Not to us. Not in a language built for us. But there was no other word for it. No one remembered hearing the vibration. But every instrument confirmed it happened. Not silence. Not malfunction. Just absence of perception. Our ears didn't register what the equipment did. I stared at the graph long after everyone else left. It didn't change. The line stayed stable. Like a needle carving through time, cutting just deep enough to be recorded, but not felt. By evening, I couldn't name certain tools. I pointed at a device and called it the wrong thing. Not a slip. Not a moment of fatigue. The wrong name came with certainty. It took a beat before I corrected myself. I tried to explain the sensation. It wasn't forgetting. It was knowing something as the wrong thing, completely, without hesitation. I looked at the spool reader and called it a thermocline loop. That's not a term that exists. But in that moment it felt correct. Not a guess. A fact. More words began to pull away. Chair. Cable. Horizon. I knew them. I could describe them. I couldn't retrieve the labels. I tested myself with inventory sheet. I had to stop halfway through when I found my own name difficult to pronounce. I recorded everything. Every moment. Every lap. I listened to my own voice narrating details I didn't recall witnessing. Not hallucinations. Events. Real. Documented. Just not part of my memory. I remembered something today I know for certain never happened. A conversation about the depth line on the west face. I remember nodding, responding, asking for clarification. But when I play the footage back, I'm not present. I'm not in the shot. The voice answering is mine. The words are what I remember. But my body isn't there. I don't exist in that space, but I do in the recording. The memory is anchored. Too complete to doubt. Too wrong to trust. It didn't feel like I was forgetting. It felt like the world had moved slightly, just a degree, just enough that every truth I carried had shifted out of sync. No warning. No break. Just slow dislocation. What I believed, what I remembered, what I could verify, all moving further apart. There is no procedure for this. No protocol for a past that reaches forward, not as warning, but as certainty. There is no safety when the first thing you lose is the order of what came before. The camera feed was grainy, but the timestamps were clear. No jump cuts, no sign of tampering. Just the corridor outside the lab, one angle, continuous playback. I counted 3 people pass through. All familiar. All expected. Nothing strange. Until the 4th pass. Same boot. Same stride. Same jacket. A second version of someone who had already walked through 2 minutes earlier. Not a replay. Not a loop. They passed behind a hanging sheet, came out the other side, turned the corner. Slight difference in gait. A limp that hadn't been there before. The footage continued. 2 more copies passed through in the next 12 minutes. Identical, but not repeated. Each slightly off. One rubbed his temple. One looked directly at the camera. One blinked more than normal. I watched all of it in silence. The room was quiet. Outside the monitors, I could hear someone in the distance laughing. I rewound the feed again. The shadows lined up. The time held. The angles shifted just enough to break the illusion of replay. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't compression error. It was replication. Unexplained. Unacknowledged. Later that day, during a briefing, someone asked a question I'd already answered. I was sure of it. Word for word. I'd already said it. Same tone. Same phrasing. I paused. Waited for someone else to react. No one did. The conversation carried on, like the first version had never occurred. I responded again, but slower, less certain. As if hearing myself speak from a different memory. The next morning, I heard two people arguing near the north trench. Quiet at first. One insisted the partition wall had always been there. The other was visibly confused. There was no map, no log, no evidence of a wall at that location. I checked the archive. Photos from last week showed open ground. No obstruction. But the one who believed in the wall was adamant. Said he'd leaned against it the first day. Swore it was part of the original perimeter. He said he remembered the texture of the stone. No one could prove him wrong. The wall was there now. I started keeping my own records on paper only. No devices. I wrote without time stamps, without digital backup. One morning I opened my bag to find an extra notebook. It was mine. No doubt. Same brand, same binding. But older. Worn at the corners. Filled cover to cover. My handwriting. Legible. Detailed. Entries I had no memory of writing. Dated next week. The first page described a conversation I hadn't had. The next described weather we hadn't experienced. The third detailed a conflict that hadn't happened yet. I turned page after page. Some words were familiar. Specific phrases I knew I was capable of writing. But the structure felt foreign. Not artificial. Just more settled. As if the version of me who had written it had been less afraid. I tested the pages. I tried copying one entry by hand to compare. The pen caught on certain words, like my own muscle memory didn't want to obey. My fingers hesitated where the ink had flowed easily before. The original looked cleaner. More practiced. Not as if I had rehearsed it. As if I had already lived it. I took the notebook to the lab tent. Placed it under a document scanner. The system recognized the file structure. It named the scanned document with a tag format we hadn't used yet. A naming convention not implemented in our versioning system. It filed itself into a directory labeled by date. The date matched the entry on page 36. I hadn't read that one yet. I opened it. A paragraph described the moment I was living. In too much detail to dismiss. The exact table position. The layout of the lights. My posture. The line I had just read aloud. The next sentence said I would hesitate, close the book, and leave without saying anything. I closed the book. I left without speaking. Reality hadn't shifted. Time hadn't fractured. I was still inside something ordinary. The light buzzed overhead. The dust hung in the air. My feet made the same sound on gravel. Nothing bent. Nothing screamed. The horror wasn't in distortion. It was in perfect continuity. In being surrounded by things that matched, line for line, a future I had not yet reached. A future someone had already written for me with my own hand. He stopped speaking to the rest of us 3 days before he vanished. Not out of anger. Not fear. There was no argument, no moment of conflict. Just a quiet withdrawal, like he'd stepped further into a version of the site none of us could access. He ate alone. Slept with the light on. Stopped responding to messages. He moved his cot to the far end of the secondary tent and started pinning sketches to the canvas walls. I looked through them once, early in the morning before the others woke. 2 maps side by side. Identical in outline, different in content. The first showed the world we knew. Landmasses shaped by familiar tectonic. The second had no labels. Just faint lines, etched over the same continents, offset slightly. Not new continents. Not old ones. A shadow layout. Topography that didn't match any known record, yet seemed uncannily logical. As if the terrain had been erased carefully, not lost through erosion but overwritten by newer layers pretending to be original. He called it the prior state. He believed the object was repairing something. Not broken in the present, but altered in the past. The device, according to him, wasn't activating. It was restoring. He didn't use words like malfunction or anomaly. He spoke with quiet certainty, the way someone does when they've stopped needing to convince anyone else. He said we weren't finding artifacts, we were being corrected, that we weren't the original version of ourselves, that memory wasn't failing, it was resisting. He said the object didn't change us, it reminded us. The last time I heard his voice was on an internal log I didn't remember saving. The file had no creation date. It appeared in the archive between scheduled backups, nestled in the middle of a completed folder with no indication it had ever been accessed before. His voice was calm, steady, more at ease than I'd ever heard it. We were a rewrite. That's what he said. A correction. A second pass. And now the older script is bleeding through. We weren't supposed to remember. That was part of the seal. But memory is mechanical, and eventually even the best machinery slip. This isn't interference. It's alignment. Things are returning to the way they were, and we were never meant to see both. That was the end of the message. No goodbye. No instruction. Just those words, spoken into whatever recorder he trusted more than his own mind. When I checked his tent, his bunk was empty. The blankets folded. The sketches still pinned. The maps untouched. His clothes were gone. His bag was gone. His badge wasn't in the logbook. I walked through camp 3 times. Checked every corner. Every register. Every note. No one else noticed. No one mentioned him. I asked once, directly. The answer came back sharp, unthinking. We didn't bring an engineer. Are you sure you're not thinking of someone else? I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what part of me still believed they were telling the truth. Not lying. Not hiding. Truly convinced there had never been another man in the tent. His handwriting was still on the whiteboard. A line about seismic refraction left half-finished. His tools were gone, but his name was burned into the metal box where they had been stored. I touched the letters. They were cold. Solid. The name meant nothing to anyone but me. I repeated it under my breath, just once, to keep it real. To feel the sound pass through my mouth, while it still belonged to something that had existed. I heard myself say a sentence I hadn't spoken yet. Not an echo. Not a memory. My voice, full and clear, 2 seconds before I opened my mouth. I paused, unsure whether to continue, whether speaking would confirm something or cancel it. I repeated the sentence, word for word. The match was perfect. Tone, breath, pace. I waited for someone to react. No one noticed. I walked to the security station that night. I didn't want answers. I wanted proof that I still existed in the time I believed I occupied. I queued up the feed from the mess tent. I watched myself enter. Or someone shaped like me. I leaned over the table, spoke to a technician. She nodded. I handed her a folder. I turned away. I watched it again. I didn't remember that conversation. I never held that folder. I checked my bag. The folder was there, unsigned. Later, I watched another feed, one I hadn't authorized. Time-stamped 48 hours ahead. A corridor shot. Night view. The object in my hands. I was walking away from the lab, toward the ridgeline. No security escort. No alert. My expression was blank. My pace steady. The object was uncovered. I held it like it belonged to me. I stopped just before the edge of frame. The recording ended. The file was sealed under my name. I went to the same corridor. Stood in the same spot. I stood there for 30 minutes. No one passed. No cameras activated. I checked the logs. No motion detected during that period. But the footage existed. It hadn't been copied. It hadn't been altered. It had been captured. But not here. Not in the version I could touch. I stopped appearing in the footage after that. Not just in the future clips. The current logs. The archives. I would hear myself speak. I'd see the room react. But there would be no one in my place. Chairs shifted. Pages turned. My voice filled the space. But the frame was empty. Others saw it. Some laughed. A few called it a glitch. I didn't respond. I sat on the edge of my cot with the recorder in my hand and counted my breath. Not to calm myself. To count something real. Something I could hear without needing to witness. I spoke into the recorder. Listened to the playback. My words returned with slight delay. 2 seconds off. Every time. As if the device knew what I would say before I did. I opened a terminal to check the log entries. My notes were there. Too many. Some I remembered writing. Some I didn't. Some described things that hadn't occurred yet. One detailed a dream I hadn't had. Another mentioned a moment from my childhood I hadn't thought about in 20 years. The entries had my style, my syntax, but something felt too resolved, too assured. Like they came from a version of me that didn't doubt. I stopped checking after I found one file marked private. Password protected. It opened without a prompt. My voice. Reading back the entire day ahead, hour by hour. Each segment ended with a question I hadn't asked. A quiet question to myself, spoken in a tone I had never used. That night, I searched the entire camp for signs of myself. Not as metaphor. Literally. I looked for my reflection. My shadow. My signature. My handwriting on labels began to degrade. The pen strokes too straight. Too clean. The human edge was missing. The warmth of pressure no longer pressed into the paper. There are 2 of me now. Or none. One recording. One being recorded. One who remembers walking away, and one who never left the chair. I can't prove which version is speaking. I only know something is being preserved. Not me. The act of me. The shape I left behind. The voice that continues, even after the room forgets the body. I packed in silence. No urgency. No announcement. No farewell. Just small movements, deliberate, unhurried, as if rushing would confirm something I couldn't undo. The plan was simple. Hike to the relay point, call for extraction, leave without confronting what stayed behind. I told no one. I left before sunrise, with the sky gray and low and the ground dry enough to betray every step. The first road had collapsed. Not damaged. Not weathered. Collapsed. As if it had never been paved. As if the material had returned to sediment, as if its history had been revoked. The path that should have taken me to the ridge was blocked by terrain I didn't recognize. The GPS refused to load. The screen remained frozen, displaying coordinates that shifted every time I blinked. I tried to call for assistance. The signal pulsed once, connected, then rerouted. A voice answered. Not in any language I recognized. Not garbled. Structured. Cadence intact. The voice spoke 3 sentences, paused, repeated one of them with altered inflection, then disconnected. I tried another contact. The call rang twice, redirected to a number with too many digits. I heard a sound that might have been a person exhaling into a microphone, followed by silence. Messages bounced back with rejection codes I had never seen. They weren't errors. They were acknowledgments, as if the system had received the request and chosen not to comply. The metadata listed my name as null. The timestamps were dated 3 years earlier. I reached the perimeter checkpoint. The logbook was gone. The guard station unstaffed. The cable spool used for electrical supply had been unwound and buried under sand. I stood there, staring at the cable's loose end, the copper exposed, the insulation peeled back cleanly, like it had never been used. I looked at the ridge again. The air shimmered. Not with heat. With absence. With the shape of something no longer offering resistance. I returned to the storage tent and found the manifest folder under the supply bin. One sheet at the back. Printed. Signed. A shipment of excavation tools, lighting equipment, and soil filters scheduled for June 2023. Signed by me. Not a forgery. Not a copy. My signature. My initials. My identification number, correct down to the last character. I held the paper to the light. The ink had set long ago. The page had creased at the fold, like it had traveled. I flipped it over. A note had been scribbled in the corner. 3 lines, no date, no attribution. A list of items I had only requested last month. 2 of them hadn't been delivered yet. One hadn't been invented when the form was dated. The signature was not recent. It had age, but the pen stroke was too recent in my muscle memory to ignore. I remembered signing it. I didn't remember when. That was the problem. The signature didn't belong to the past. It belonged to the version of me that had just tried to leave. I returned to my cot without unpacking. Sat on the edge. Looked at my hands. They were steady. That frightened me more than anything else. The road was gone. The systems had let me go silent. The devices still recorded, but none of them recognized my name. I had not been removed. I had been unlisted. I whispered my own name aloud once. The sound felt unfamiliar in my throat. Like something learned, not owned. I repeated it again. Slower. As if the shape might fall apart if I rushed. I waited for a response. There was none. Not from the room. Not from the camp. Not from whatever had started this. It occurred to me that nothing here had tried to stop me. Not the object. Not the people. Not the place. Nothing had needed to interfere. Something else had made the decision long before I considered leaving. Something had rewritten the terms of my presence. All I had left was the memory of a plan that no longer mattered. I haven't slept in 6 days. At least I don't think I have. I've stopped marking the hours. The clocks loop. The sky repeats. Shadows stretch longer than the objects that cast them, then reset before they should. The mornings come in reverse. The nights have no edge. I wake up and the coffee's already brewed. I never started the pot. I never touched the stove. But the cup is warm. Always warm. Always the same amount poured, the same stain beneath the handle. I don't drink it anymore. I just watch it sit there, as if some version of me still needs it. The tags on my shirts used to carry my name. The stitched thread has thinned. The lettering is faded like it's been scrubbed too many times. Yesterday, I pulled on my jacket and checked the collar. The tag was blank. No initials. Just frayed white cloth where letters should have been. I opened my field notebook. My signature on the cover was gone. Not scratched off. Not erased. Absorbed. The fibers of the paper undisturbed. The ink never existed. I flipped through the pages. The words were still there. Observations, charts, sketches. But every place I'd written my name was missing. Not blacked out. Not whited. Just gone, as if I had never claimed ownership of what I had seen. I checked my ID badge this morning. The photo remained. The barcode too. But where the name should have been, there was only a gray line. A placeholder, waiting for content that hadn't been entered. I scanned it at the door. The reader blinked. Denied access. No error code. No refusal. Just absence. Like the system didn't recognize that a request had even been made. I haven't spoken out loud today. I've lost the cadence of my own voice. The tone changes when I hear it played back. I sound older. Or younger. Or like someone imitating me from memory. I leave the recorder on, not to capture anything, but to prove I still make sound. This will be the last entry. Not because I've made peace with it. There's no peace here. Only stillness. The kind that thickens behind your eyes. I don't know if this will be found. I don't know who will hear it. I don't know if I still exist beyond the boundaries of this narration. I don't know what version of me is holding the pen. So I'm going to tell you what I remember. The first thing. Before this place. Before the object. Before I started forgetting. I remember sitting at the bottom of a shallow pool. I was 5. Summer. Water warm from sunlight, barely moving. I held my breath and looked up at the surface. I could see my mother's shadow on the water. Her voice was muffled, distant. I could see the outline of her hand reaching in, calling me up. But I stayed under a few seconds longer, watching the light bend, watching the edges of the world warp, just slightly. I remember thinking I was outside something. Not drowning. Not afraid. Just observing. Like I had found a pocket of space that didn't follow the same rules. That's the first time I understood what it meant to stand just apart from what's real. That moment. That small act of staying beneath the surface. I remember that more clearly than anything else. The shape of the tile. The sound of my own breath trapped in my ears. The taste of the water when I surfaced. That's who I am. Or was. Or want to be again. If memory is the last thing to go, I'm choosing mine. Not the things I've recorded. Not the words on these pages. Just that one moment. The pool. The hand above. The space between. If I vanish, let it be into that. Let it be into something I chose. Let it be into the part of myself that looked up from below and saw the world for what it was, reachable but not quite ready to return. The site is quiet. Not abandoned, just emptied of purpose. The wind moves across it without resistance. No voices, no footsteps, only the low drone of something too constant to be natural. It doesn't rise or fall. It just holds, like the sound is waiting for a response that will never come. The tents are collapsed. The scaffolds lean inward, not broken, but softened. As if time pressed them down with slow, deliberate weight. The cables trail into the dirt and vanish before reaching their end. The generator is still there, but the housing is open, and the inside is hollow. Not stolen. Not stripped. Just removed, as though it had never been needed. Near the edge of the pit, the dust collects in shallow spirals. Something buried beneath the surface interrupts the pattern. A corner of metal, dull, unmoving. It doesn't shine. It doesn't pulse. It just waits. The shape isn't exposed fully. Only part of it breaches the surface, the rest claimed again by the earth. Not hidden. Not lost. Recovered by the ground that once held it, as if the act of discovery had been reversed. Close by, a page rests against the wall of a collapsed crate. One of the old journals. The edges curl, the ink recedes. Not all at once. Line by line, the letters pull inward, retracting from meaning. The sentences unform in slow retreat. What remains are impressions. Pressure without pigment. A memory of where language used to live. Beside the case lies a photo. Laminated. Protected. A group standing in front of the trench wall, the dig still in progress behind them. The expressions are tired, but familiar. The tools slung over shoulders, the tags still visible. The same photo sits beneath it. Same light, same posture, same time of day. But one detail refuses alignment. In the second copy, a figure has been added. No movement. No blur. Just presence. The face resists focus. Eyes shift out of sync. The shape holds, but the features never resolve. No one in the photo seems to notice. Their eyes look past the figure, expressions unchanged. As if the addition wasn't new, only long delayed. A correction made after the fact. There's no closing signature. No confirmation of authorship. No record of who returned the photos to the archive. Only a faint mark in the corner. A number. Not a date. Not a code, a count, or a reminder, or maybe just what's left when identity slips beneath the surface and waits, still, to be reassembled. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.